I'm Lucy.
And I'm Jennifer.
You're listening to Everything I Know About.
Each week, we share everything we know about a new topic, equipped with some internet research and a little too much exposure to pop culture. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome back to week 3 of our Haunted October series.
Yeah, your background is very fitting right now, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. I did relocate specifically so we could get the vibes in here. The little finger candles.
Yeah, very Victorian. My only change is my plant is now dying, so at least there's that dead vibe.
Where is its soul going?
It's been clinging on to dear life for a good year, so it maybe is time for it to pass into the next realm. It'll go on a journey, as we talked about in our last episode.
Love it. Well, this week we are talking about souls that don't go on their journeys and stick around in the earthly realm and the haunted cities in which you can find them. So I was introduced to the concept of ghost tours in an academic lens by somebody that I follow on TikTok. Her name is Kristen. Her @ is book reviews. That's book RVWS. She's great. She's on Instagram and TikTok. But she's getting her PhD in history right now and taking a class on ghost tours. And it just got me thinking about all of the historical narratives that we don't typically hear in the mainstream public sphere because they're deemed fringe knowledge, or these stories about abused women or slaves or indigenous people that may not make it into the history books, but make it into these ghost tours and are part of the local culture and history.
I found this quote from a historian, Taya Miles, who said that, quote, ghost stories make it a point to render what is taboo, frightening, and alien to mainstream society. This means that the ghost story is potentially a form of radical historical narrative that can dredge up unsettling social memories for re-examination. And I think the question that we're going to keep coming back to in this episode is, what are these ghost stories telling us? Beyond the titillation of hearing the stories themselves, do they have a deeper meaning? What can we learn from them? And why is it important that these stories survive?
This is how you know we don't talk before the episode starts, because actually I was looking at Taya Miles too.
Oh,
She's apparently just this incredible historian, and I didn't know much about her before doing research for this, but I was looking at her book, Tales from the Haunted South.
yeah. I also
Were you looking at
that?
I read something similar where she was talking about how collective truths that have been ignored or downplayed in the public sphere, like slavery and gender violence, like ghost tours, force them to be taken seriously, because ghost tours and dark tourism have become so profitable that these historical sites need to integrate those narratives. So I thought that was a really interesting lens from which to look at it. Like, this is an economic driver.
Yeah, those questions were swirling around my mind too. Like, when you introduce the economic consequences, yes, it brings in money to the city, but then as a con, and we kind of got into this a little bit even in our tourism episode with the consequences of dark tourism, but it's essentially the commodification of death and suffering, and tourists are just not thinking critically about the meaning or deeper connections.
Yeah, I heard something similar in my research, which was, well, ghost tourism does introduce the concept to us. Like, we get the conversation going about slavery and about gendered violence and indigenous violence. It's from a safe emotional distance where it's kind of washed over. It becomes part of this fantastical story while removing us from the harsh realities. And it can actually be counterproductive because it enforces these sort of romanticized view of the South that doesn't bring the harsh realities of slavery and violence into play.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because even in our last episode, I made that comment about, oh, like Nashville haunted houses must be good. And when I was editing that episode, Avery was listening to me edit, and he was like, why did you say that? Like, that makes no sense. I was like, why did I think that the South would be good at haunted houses? And then I realized, researching for this episode, subconsciously in my mind, the South is associated with these like ghost tours, haunted cities.
Yeah. Subconsciously, we know that there was so much horror that happened here.
Yeah.
That there must just be some lingering horrors around.
Yes, totally.
And that is totally validated by the cities that we researched.
Yeah, so I looked at New Orleans in particular, which is a city Jennifer and we actually went to together in a previous job. But I've only been to once. I did not do a ghost tour while I was there, so I was excited to look into some of the local lore. And Jennifer, you covered Savannah.
Yeah, so I went to Savannah for the first time recently for a wedding, and it had such haunted vibes. I loved it. I was obsessed with it. But when we were doing research for this episode, it kept coming up as one of the most haunted cities in America, which I kind of knew, but I didn't know why. So very happy to share why that is later on in this episode.
Let's dive in. I'll start.
Yes.
Okay, so New Orleans. I thought it was so funny because even New Orleans' tourism website, their catchphrase once you land on the page is ghosts, gumbo, and good times. So they're definitely leaning heavily into the haunted history of the city. So I am going to start with a ghost story and then dive in from there. So it is pretty famous. Like American Horror Story did a version of this. But I think it's a great example of a ghost story that we can kind of unpack the many layers of. So the story I'm going to tell is of the LaLaurie Mansion on Royal Street. Is it ringing any bells?
I'm just reminiscing about this season of American Horror Story.
Oh, okay. You watch the show. Maybe you know
Oh my God. It's like one of my favorite shows ever. Yes.
Okay. All right. So for those who are less familiar, Delphine LaLaurie was a slave owner who was known for being exceptionally cruel. She regularly whipped her slaves. There was a 12-year-old girl who she was whipping, and the girl tried to run away, and she fell off the roof and died. This triggered the authorities to investigate, and because cruel treatment to slaves was technically prohibited by law, I honestly was pretty surprised by that.
Wow.
LaLaurie's slaves were taken away and sold at auction. Unfortunately, one of LaLaurie's friends then bought them and gave them back to her.
What a bitch.
I know. Things then went quiet until a fire began in the kitchen in 1834. And some say that this was intentionally set by the cook, hoping for outside intervention. So firemen come to the house, and in an upstairs room, they find horrifically mutilated enslaved people who are still alive.
Ugh.
When the people from the community saw what had been done to these slaves, they rioted, destroyed the house, and the LaLauries supposedly barely escaped. The gutted house then sat sealed for years and eventually was sold to Nicolas Cage, interestingly
What?
enough. Yeah, in 2007. And he sold it again in 2008. And word on the street is he was too scared to even spend one night there.
I don't blame him.
So that's the lore that is such a major part of the ghost tour industry. Interestingly enough, that book that we both looked at, Tales from the Haunted South, that book actually looks at primary sources to recount what happened with the LaLauries, and it actually matches this tale fairly closely. That book points out that the rioting mob thought about taking it even further and going after other slaveholders in the neighborhood. When I read that, I was like, wow, I'm really surprised by the fact that the mob reacted so angrily towards the LaLauries, but they were okay with slavery in general. Like somehow they were able to reconcile that in their minds. And I just
Yeah.
couldn't really understand that. And the article I was reading about this helped me in that they put it this way. Quote, in other words, the LaLauries were seen as both exceptional and unexceptional, a contradiction that encapsulated the cognitive dissonance that living with slavery required. They had to be monstered in order for other enslavers to keep the mob from their own doors.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. It clicked for me then because I was like, yeah, absolutely. In this ghost story, like the community is portrayed as these righteous people who looked at LaLaurie, and even the authorities in this context were like, oh, you're particularly bad. We're going to fight against you and like run you out of town. Which obviously they were owning slaves themselves and also accepting that that was just a normal part of life in their community and not doing anything about that.
Yeah, their own survival rested on villainizing these people who do such horrible things as if they're not part of that exact same group.
Yeah. From what I read, this is like the main story that is highlighted about New Orleans. Depending on the tour you go to, I'm sure. But like, there's actually not a ton of other slave stories that are told, with this being the primary one. And it seemed like from what I was reading, that was maybe because this is honestly the most grisly. Like it has that shock value that these ghost tour operators are ultimately peddling. But I think on the other side of that, I was like, oh, well, it also helps the city distance itself because it makes it seem like, oh, it was just this like bad couple. That wasn't us. Like that was othered. That was this
Yeah.
bad couple, you know?
Yeah, this is such an anomaly that we're making it a central
Mhm.
part of our history because this certainly didn't happen here.
Right.
We certainly didn't treat our Black population this poorly. No, no, no. That was just this one incident.
Exactly. I read this really interesting article in Lux magazine. The author is Sarah Jaffe, a resident of New Orleans who was talking about the ghost tours and weaving it into the narrative of the negative impacts of tourism in general on her city. How people come in, go on these ghost tours, which often focus on like New Orleans history of slavery in particular and Black death, but like slightly more removed because it's a little bit further in the past. And she draws a parallel to actually Katrina and the fact that Katrina is still impacting New Orleans today. And that's a much more recent example where, in particular, the Black community really suffered. Quote, you can walk through St. Louis Cemetery and drop a token at the grave of voodoo priestess Marie Laveau, marked with red X's for luck and blessings. And you can walk past homes that were marked with a different red X after the storm. An X that told rescue workers the home had been searched and how many people, alive or otherwise, had been found.
Holy shit.
So powerful, right?
Wow. That's such a powerful image.
I mean, there's so much to unpack. No wonder we're freaking haunted. Like, people committed atrocities, and ghosts are literally souls who could not make it past to the spirit realm because horrible things happened to them in real life. You have that combined with the fact that those things are still happening today. I think the Katrina example is so interesting because you would never be like, oh, one day they're going to be like telling a ghost story about Katrina. Like, that was a natural disaster, right? But humans for sure had a role to play in how Katrina impacted that community, both in all the things that it did beforehand in terms of what communities were at risk and afterwards in terms of the response and who got aid and if that community was able to get the reinvestment it needed to recover. And clearly, not only New Orleans, but like many cities impacted by Katrina have not been. Like, they're poor cities, right? So yeah, I don't know. I obviously don't have this figured out by any means, but I was just very, like, my brain was like tingling with all the connections here.
Yeah, it's such a different way to look at these stories, which, I mean, we could have done an episode where we just told you all of the gruesome, macabre things that we found on the internet, and that would have been one way to look at this. But that's so boring compared to what we can learn from them. And like, yeah, it's really uncomfortable to look at when you make those connections.
To me, it's like if one were to ask, again, this theme of our episode, which is like, what is the purpose of these ghost stories? Like, what are they trying to tell us? On the one hand, I buy into what you said at the beginning of the episode, which is thank God they do exist because they are telling real stories that are often overlooked and help us not forget in a way. I think another maybe more complicated way to look at it is like, is it somewhat distracting? Because the reality of these things is like when you put it into almost like Disneyified, commercialized product, it also allows us to distance ourselves from that history, even when that history is repeating itself and it's happening to us right now, which I think is that Katrina example. But also, I found this quote. This is actually about Savannah from This American Life. But the quote is, it's almost like if you turn critical race theory into a book of ghost stories, all of the white folks who hate it would love it. So it's that like entertainment value. In a positive way, I'm like, oh, this is history. This is education masquerading as entertainment. Coating the medicine in a spoonful of sugar makes it go down easier. And hopefully you learn something as long as you are able to make those connections and not just treating it as temporary entertainment.
This is a conversation that comes up over and over again, even in literature, when we have like Uncle Tom's Cabin and some of these entertainment novels, movies, films that water down the gruesome realities of what's going on, like these social issues, but they bring it into the conversation and they create a layer of empathy that may not have been there before. And I think there's valid criticism to that approach, but I feel like it also does more good than bad in the overall. Like, for instance, when we start talking about these ghost stories in New Orleans and Savannah, I don't know that I'm walking around New Orleans and Savannah thinking about the slave history or the gruesome things that happened. But since I know about these ghost tours and about the stories, honestly, when I was walking around Savannah, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about the fact that, oh, this is a place where enslaved people lived and horrible things happened here. And like that harbor was a place where the transatlantic slave trade happened. Like it has this impact of history that I wouldn't have thought otherwise. So it does keep it in the forefront of your mind if you're looking at it that way, if you're like intentionally doing your tourism that way. But I do understand both sides of that argument for sure.
Yeah. It's almost like there's the fact itself, like the history of what happened. Then there's the story of that, which is already removed from the truth, because obviously it's filtered through the lens of both the person telling the story and the person receiving the story. And then another layer on top of that is like, does it generate money? And is money somehow complicating that even more? The other thing I really wanted to look into because of New Orleans is obviously voodoo, which is not something I knew a ton about. Maybe you did with your spooky knowledge.
No, I'm so fascinated by voodoo. I'm so happy you did research on it. I've wanted to know more about it for so long, but I don't know much. I just know the little dolls. But that's
Yes,
it.
yes. I feel like my only exposure was that Scooby Doo movie, the like live action Scooby Doo. Voodoo is a big part of the plot.
I'm proud to say I've never seen that.
I don't know if you should be proud. It was a great movie. Scooby Doo was an iconic symbol of my generation, of our generation. So, voodoo is the only Afro Catholic religion to emerge in North America. It is an amalgamation of so many influences. So, its roots are in West African religion. People would carry these talismans called gree. These are small cloth or leather bags of blessed objects believed to have magical properties. Originally, a gree may have contained a folded piece of paper with verses from an ancestor or an inscription from the Quran, because West African religion was actually influenced by Muslim scholars and mystics. Where the gree was worn on the body related to its purpose, whether that's protection, health, wealth, or social harmony, all require a different placement. When slaves were brought from West Africa to the New World, many of their customs and practices were then influenced by European Catholicism and cultures in the Caribbean. New Orleans voodoo emerged from the influx of enslaved Africans and Haitian refugees whose practices blended with elements of New Orleans culture, such as Native American traditions and European folklore like witchcraft.
Got it. The West African people that were taken into the transatlantic slave trade mixed with the cultures where they were brought to.
Yes.
And then the outcome is the voodoo religion.
Yes.
Okay.
So the outcome is the voodoo religion. And then there's the perception of voodoo in popular culture, which is that it's associated with dark magic, evil. There's a lot of misunderstanding around it. And so how did that association get made? Essentially, white people's perception of voodoo. Well, voodoo hits mainstream awareness in 1773 because of a court case in which several slaves were tried for conspiring to kill their master by using gree. And by now, these gree have evolved, like a voodoo doll is a type of gree, and these dolls have a reputation for being a method of controlling another person. So it starts to potentially be a little more sinister than just a talisman or amulet for protection. Because voodoo was tied to a slave rebellion, slave owners started to fear that this was a dark and powerful magic that would help their slaves rebel and become free. And the reputation voodoo was already gaining was strengthened with the Haitian Revolution in 1791. The Haitian Revolution actually began with a voodoo ceremony. A voodoo priest led the service, which included sacrificing a pig and a blood oath to overthrow the French. A few days later, rebel slaves began to burn the sugar plantations and kill the white population. So, as the story of this spread, it just further heightened the fear around voodoo and the villainization of it.
Do people still practice voodoo?
Yes, the religion is monotheistic, but it also involves the worship of spirits and praying to these lesser deities.
Truly no magical elements. Like I'm thinking of Wicca, for instance. Technically it's a religion, but it's also like an occult religion or like the pagan religions of past. I was envisioning voodoo as more along those lines rather than an Abrahamic religion like Catholicism or Islam. So do they have any spells, magic, charms, like the stuff that we would more readily associate with an occult practice?
There definitely are occult elements. So the core belief is that God does not interfere in daily life, but spirits do, which is why you pray to these lesser deities, you carry around protection. Connection to these spirits can be obtained through rituals like dance, music, chanting. And then the gree bags themselves are like spirits and have to be taken care of. So you should do things like play your gree music and once a week light some incense as an offering for it. There are also potions. I guess this is kind of like witches in the little I know about that, which is that a lot of potions, the purpose is to heal yourself and your community. They're meant to help with anxiety, addiction, feelings of depression. Like the most famous voodoo representative in New Orleans is Marie Laveau, who is the queen of voodoo.
It was also an American Horror Story.
Yes, and I was trying to figure out, why is this considered scary? Like, why is she part of ghost tours? It really just seems like she was a businesswoman. Like, she was making these potions and, like, yeah, making these dolls and selling them to white people who wanted to buy them. And that was seemingly kind of it.
So she was making like a tourist spectacle out of voodoo?
I think she was practicing voodoo and white people wanted to purchase her goods and she would
Okay.
sell it to them. This is like, I don't even remember which book this is. Practical Magic, I'm thinking maybe. Isn't that like the sisters are witches and they like make potions for their community?
Mhm.
That's what I was picturing.
Okay.
I mean, the stories are mixed, but supposedly she was a hairdresser to like wealthy white women, which is how she earned their trust. They would tell her their stories and secrets. And then there's multiple stories of these white women coming to her house in these carriages late at night and like leaving with goods that they bought from her, which I'm like, okay, seeing a lot of parallels here to practical magic.
Yeah.
Marie Laveau did participate in these ceremonies, and this was a place called Congo Square in New Orleans, which was a gathering place every Sunday for enslaved Africans. And a bunch of people would come to this square and practice their traditions, including voodoo. And that would involve hundreds of people forming drum circles, conducting spiritual ceremonies, and she would go and like sell her goods. The legend is that she would sing and perform and she would conjure great spirits and she would wear like a queen of voodoo crown.
So is Marie Laveau the reason that New Orleans is considered the voodoo capital?
She's not the reason. She's just a person who is very famous for practicing voodoo. I think the reason is because voodoo really like developed there.
Okay. More of like the confluence of all of the cultures and religions that gave rise to voodoo.
Yes.
They all collided in New Orleans.
Yes.
And it's still there. That's so
It's
cool.
still
I did
there.
not know it was still
Yeah.
a religion today. That's amazing. Now I want to go see it for myself. I want to go to New Orleans and go to one of these voodoo shops. I bet there are still some. There have to be
Oh, I'm sure.
real voodoo people, not like tourism voodoo people, like
Well, like,
practicing voodoo
yeah, I'm
people.
like, also like, what's the difference? If you really practice voodoo, but also can make some money, like, good for you.
No, 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 that's great. No, I just don't want some like random Catholic person selling
Sure.
fake voodoo fare. No, no, no. I want a voodoo person selling me voodoo
Yeah,
fare.
you gotta go and ask around and get the local recommendations for where to go, I'm sure.
I would drop a bag. I would drop so much money on that stuff. Okay, well, that's fascinating. And Savannah, my city that I looked at, doesn't have something quite as iconic as voodoo going for it. And I think that's why we probably don't think of it as one of America's most haunted cities. New Orleans just immediately comes to mind, but Savannah, not so much. However, when you Google it, it consistently pops up all over the place. So I just want to paint the picture of Savannah for you so we have a mental image to go into if you've never been. So Savannah is in Georgia. It's close to the ocean. Imagine cobblestone streets, moss tree canopies, occult shops all over the place. We have flickering gas lamps, colonial style homes, and Southern Gothic mansions. It is ripe for all of the ghost storytelling. And when I was there, they really lean into their history with this. Like when I tell you there's occult shops all over the place, I'm talking like every third shop is like a tarot reader, or like there will literally be skulls in the windows. It's very haunted feeling. So I was curious, like, how does a city get a reputation for being haunted? Like an entire city. I can understand if there's
Mhm.
like one or two ghost stories, but how does the whole city just become haunted? And for Savannah in particular, there were three or four different historical events that made it haunted. The first being there were a ton of wars. So between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, Savannah was front and center for a lot of these bloody battles. They say it left a spiritual residue of unsettled soldier souls. So, one example is in 1779, the Siege of Savannah killed 240 soldiers during the Revolutionary War, and those soldiers are known to be haunting Savannah to this day. The second, again, back to slavery. Slavery was one of the major integral parts of Savannah's economy for a few hundred years, unfortunately. So Savannah was heavily dependent on slave labor, and the Savannah port played an integral role in the Atlantic slave trade. Stories say that those enslaved people still seek vengeance against their captors. And there's actually one particular slave ship story that I'm going to share in a bit that'll kind of illuminate all of this for us. The third is major fires and disease. So in
Hmm.
1796 and 1820, there were two major fires that ravaged the city. This kind of made me think of the Chicago fires because I was
Mm.
seeing Chicago pop up on some of these haunted lists. And I'm like, huh, I wonder if it's these fires and major disasters that make
Yeah.
it land on these lists. But between these two fires in Savannah, it resulted in thousands of deaths. And also in 1820, the yellow fever killed a tenth of Savannah's population.
Wow.
That is so much.
That's similar to New Orleans.
Oh, they
Yellow
had,
fever. Yeah, that's another reason why it's considered haunted too.
wow.
Lots of people dying. I guess also the South, these like mosquito heavy places.
Yeah. So is all of Europe haunted then because of the Black Death? Like that?
You would think, you would think.
Honestly,
I
yeah.
mean, the occult, right? Tell me that didn't emerge with like the Black Death and the plague.
Yeah, no, I love Europe. Love it, love it, love it, but it has a fearsome vibe to it. Like, there's something, like, a little spooky about everywhere in Europe, that is for sure. Yeah, so of the thousands of people that died of yellow fever, their souls are believed to be perplexed by their untimely passing and forever linked to the city, haunting it. So people say that just walking the streets of Savannah, you're going to see ghosts show up in windows. You're going to hear the whispers of French and Bantu being spoken in the wind. Those are two languages that were spoken by the slaves. And you'll hear the remnants of parties from past blaring, but there's no parties going on.
Mm.
So the paranormal seekers like to go to Savannah between 11:30 and 12:30, which are considered the magic witching hours. So between the hours of 11:30 and midnight is good magic hour, and then midnight to 12:30 is evil bad magic hour.
Interesting.
If you walk the streets, you can hear these paranormal activities happening. If you go on Reddit, there's actually a paranormal subreddit. And if you search Savannah in there, they tell a lot of these anecdotal stories, like to varying degrees of trustworthiness. But
So between 11:30 and midnight, like what does it mean that it's a good magic hour?
I wish I could tell you. That's all I know.
Only good spirits? Only good ghosts?
I guess that's when you practice white magic, and then black magic happens 12 to 12:30. That's when you do your evil magic with
Oh,
the
okay.
devils, the dark side of things. So, Savannah, one of the largest economies now is tourism, and they do tons of ghost stories. They actually have a lot of ghost stories related to pirates, which I thought was interesting.
Huh.
I would not have expected that, but it is a harbor town, so it makes sense. I wanted to highlight two stories in particular, one related to the pirates and one related to one of the haunted mansions that Savannah is most famous for. I'll start with the pirate slave ship, the Grietely, and I know I'm pronouncing that wrong, but it's a French pirate ship.
Okay. Well, you speak French. I'm sure you're doing a good job.
It's not spelled French though. It's like it
Oh,
has a Y. It's like ELY, which is not French. So that's why
okay.
I'm like, I don't know if this is like some weird dialect of French or something. But the story of the Grietely ship sinking.
Mm.
So I did not know this, but the international slave trade was banned in 1820 in the US. I thought it was much later than that because obviously we had the Civil War in the 1860s, but this trade itself was banned in the 1820s.
But not the owning of slaves.
Correct. However, after this, pirates still made money by gathering escaped slaves and shipping them to the Caribbean and South America. So in 1854, a French pirate ship, the Grietly, pulled into Savannah Harbor and collected 71 runaways in the Savannah area. These runaways were roped up and forcibly put on the ship. However, they were fighters. There's a reason that they escaped. They were strong and had a lot of strength of will. Those that were on the deck were able to break loose of their binds and jump in the water and swim back to shore. The pirates on the ship were distracted trying to shoot at them in the water,
Mm.
and the runaways underneath the deck were able to break free while the crew was distracted,
Okay.
and they started ripping the ship apart with their hands. They pulled
Wow.
the planks off of the starboard side and let all of the water rush into the ship, and the ship ended up sinking.
Good for them.
Good for them.
Damn.
It was a bit of a suicide mission, but the pirates and the runaways, they died.
Okay, so no one was able to escape, sadly.
I don't know.
Ah,
This
okay,
is a
right,
ghost
right.
story, so the death toll was high. So today, sailors say that they can still hear Bantu being spoken on the harbor, and they can feel a force pulling them off course in the harbor. And they truly believe that it's the slave and sailor souls that haunt the harbor and attack ships in vengeance. And the second story I want to highlight is a murder mystery in a very haunted mansion in Savannah. So this is the story of the Mercer Williams House and the murder of Danny Hansford. So you may have actually heard of this story from a 1994 best-selling novel called Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Have you heard of this book?
I have heard of the book, actually. It's ringing
Really?
bells. Yeah.
So it was made into a movie a few years later. Clint Eastwood picked it up and made it into a film, so you may have heard of the film as well.
I'm not a movie buff, so probably not from that, but maybe just because it has a beautiful title, I, like, remembered it.
It does have a beautiful title. It was a bestseller for 261 weeks, though, so it definitely made a
Wow.
splash.
Yeah.
I have not read it before, but it's based off of this house and the murders. It's a nonfiction book. So the Mercer Williams House is a 7,000 square foot mansion. It's the best known house on these ghost tours, and it has some very strange origins that are going to kind of set the scene for the events to follow. So it was first built in 1860 on top of unmarked graves from people who died in the yellow fever epidemic. Already, I mean, this thing is bound to be haunted, right? So it was commissioned by General Hugh Mercer, who actually never got to live in the home because construction was interrupted by the Civil War. And so it sat abandoned on top of these unmarked graves up until the 20th century. In the mid 20th century, it was used as a Masonic temple for the Shriners.
Oh, another throwback to previous episodes we've done.
Throwback. Yeah. The Shriners abandoned it in the mid 1900s. Then it was bought again by Jim Williams. So this is why it's the Mercer Williams House.
Mm.
Shortly before Williams bought the house, there was a family that was living in it, and they were the first to see tragedy in the home. So in 1969, 11-year-old Tommy Downs was hunting pigeons on the roof of the house, and he fell. He fell on the
Mhm.
south side of the house where there were iron spikes on a
Oh,
fence, and he was impaled.
oh my gosh, horrible.
His sister watched it happen, and it was a gruesome scene. The rescuers had to break the fence or like try to break this iron fence to save him, but ultimately he did die. His spirit is believed to still be in the home, and visitors to the home say that he can be seen reenacting the final moments of his life on loop, falling off the roof onto the iron spikes over and over. And the
Oh,
boy's sister also haunts the home, recounting the attempt to cut the iron fence and try to save Tommy's life. Very,
oh,
very sad stuff. A few years after this death happened, Jim Williams purchases the home and he starts throwing parties. He is the
okay.
party guy in Savannah. He had an infamous Christmas party, and he also started collecting what he calls his like cabinet of curiosities. So he had some very like weird occult items in his collection. He also installed a full organ. So already this place is like very
Yeah.
haunted mansion vibes, like almost a little too on the nose, Jim. Some of the things that he had in his cabinet of curiosities were a casket bearing Russian imperial coat of arms. He had Tsar Nicholas II's golden crown. He had a piece of the carriage used in the coronation of Napoleon. And he
What?
also, yeah, he also had a pair of $10,000 crystal candlesticks that were a gift from Martha and George Washington to their daughter on her wedding day. So
Wow, this guy's an eccentric for sure.
definitely very eccentric. Jim was eccentric in another way as well. He had a lover who was a former prostitute with a very sketchy past who he hired as his assistant, and his lover's name was Danny Hansford. So this was back in the 80s where homosexuality was not widely accepted yet. So they kind of lived this underground eccentric life together and were lovers in his mansion. One day, Danny and Jim got into a little bit of a tiff, and Danny knocked over a 18th century grandfather clock in the home. Jim was in his study at the time and kind of freaked out, and Danny went into the study to go chat with him or argue some more likely. And Jim says he feared for his life. He pulled out a pistol and he shoots Danny in the head and 3 times in the back.
Jim, come on. You seem
Jim,
so cool.
I know, really did a 180 there. Jim calls the police at 3 a.m. This is 30 minutes after the shooting. And the police say they thought Jim set up the crime scene to make it look like Danny was the one shooting at Jim. However, it was very clear that Jim actually did shoot Danny.
Mhm.
I mean, obviously, all the evidence pointed that
Obviously,
way.
yes. One person has a bullet in him and the other does not.
Yes. So eventually, Jim does admit that he shot in self defense. And Jim was originally tried, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison. However, he was tried again 3 more times for a total of 4 times for this crime. They overturned the original conviction, saying that the jury was biased because Jim was a gay man. So he got a second trial, and there was a hung jury in one of them. One of them was deemed a mistrial. And finally, in his fourth trial, he was found not guilty. So Jim walked away a free man after all of this.
Wow. He's
Yeah.
definitely gonna get haunted.
Well, Yup. So Jim goes back to his home and he is haunted by Danny's ghost. So he hires a voodoo practitioner, call back.
Whoa.
Yeah. Hires this voodoo practitioner to clean the house of Danny's spirit. However, the cleansing did not take hold, and it's believed that it actually strengthened the presence of the spirit in the house. Even to this day, people say they see Danny's spirit pacing the hallways, especially lingering in that study where he died.
Mhm.
Jim actually died in the study at the exact place of the shooting.
Wow.
Yes. So
What a coincidence.
what a coincidence, right? Or not. Jim's sister died in 2023. So last year she died. But previous to that, she was having none of this talk of ghost stories. She didn't think there were any ghosts in the home. And she opened it up as a museum purely for architectural reasons because it was a beautifully architected home. And it obviously was not toured as an architectural destination, but rather a ghost destination.
Yeah.
And everyone said that it just had a weird, eerie feeling in the home. You would feel the spirits walking through you in the hallways and hear disembodied voices. There's this unnerving feeling of being watched when you're in the home as well.
Mm.
And the neighbors say this is where the parties come in, that they can still hear the parties at night. And the police actually get noise complaints from parties that aren't happening.
Interesting.
Interesting.
I mean, if there's parties still going on, then did Danny and Jim reconcile? Hmm.
Oh, in the afterlife.
In the afterlife. Yeah.
All is forgiven. There are dozens of stories like this in Savannah. This is just one of them that I wanted to highlight because of its mass appeal in media after the movie and the book came out. But yeah, Savannah is home to like a lot of very strange murders in mansions that still exist that people still live in, strangely enough. Like a lot of these are still private residences that people live in.
Mhm.
So,
I'm shocked why anyone would buy a house that has that history.
right?
It's like, you don't even have to believe in ghosts, but like, why take the chance? Why?
I agree. Crazy stuff. But this was a fascinating history. I'm glad I just know so much more about voodoo now. I feel like I want to go back and actually visit Savannah, New Orleans with this new lens. Like go back and actually do a little ghost tour.
Yeah. I always felt ghost tours were so cheesy, but now I'm like, it's great for all the reasons we said. So yeah, no, it's interesting. Have you had any paranormal experiences yourself in your life?
Of course I have. Yeah.
I want to hear one of your ghost stories.
Okay. I used to live in Milwaukee. We moved there when I was in 8th grade. So I was like 12. And we lived in a part of town where all the homes were really old. They were built in like the mid 1800s and they were known to be haunted. Milwaukee has some like haunted history. And my mom is she's on the paranormal spectrum. Okay. She like feels ghosts and spirits and everything. And she's had paranormal experiences in her life where she's actually like, she's been scratched by a ghost once on her back and she had like a welt on her back. She's very afraid of them. So when we would go into these homes, the real estate agent isn't legally allowed to tell you if the home is haunted or not, or like if there's
Mm.
been deaths in the home, I think. So my mom told the real estate agent, like, hey, I am afraid of ghosts. So I know you can't tell me, but just like, give me a little nudge or something if you think this is one of the haunted ones. And there's this one home that we loved. We thought it was beautiful, but the real estate agent was like, I don't know if you're going to want to look at that one. But we did anyway. And I was, like being cavalier about it. Like, that's so cool if it's haunted. Let me go inside. And my mom's like, I'm not stepping foot in that house. She's like, I can tell from the yard that that thing is haunted. And I was like, well, I'm going in. I walk in and I was like, ooh, this is kind of eerie, but it's fun. Like, I was still in like, this is so cool and fun mode. And then I walk up the stairs and there's nothing like that I heard or saw, nothing that obvious, but there was just something about walking up those stairs that terrified me. Like it was actually genuinely terrifying. It's like your whole body is screaming at you to not walk any further up the stairs. And I ran back down the stairs and out of that house. So I'm like, yeah, we cannot look at this house. Like, I believe you, mom. You're right. That house is fucking haunted. That was like the most intense experience I had with it. But there were some homes that you would walk into and you just like have this very unsettling feeling inside of it that
Mm.
you couldn't put your finger on it. You're just like, the energy is really, really off in this house.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if you would be able to sense it if you went back to these cities now that you know that they're haunted.
Yeah. Well, I believe in all this stuff. So it's so psychosomatic for
I
me.
know,
Like,
that's
I'm
what I'm
sure, like,
saying.
yeah.
Now that you know, you're gonna think it's haunted, like because your mom had that reaction before you entered the house, you were like primed.
No, I know. I know that like all the signs point to it not being real, but it feels real. It really does.
Yeah.
Have you had experiences like this?
I have not, Thank God, because I would be fucking terrified if I did. I've had a lot of friends, though, who've had experiences, and nothing that's jumping out at me right now in terms of like something I concretely remember, but like they've reported things moving. Things that are like seemingly very inexplicable. So yeah, I mean, I believe that there's things that we can't understand as humans. And like, I feel like anybody who's like, absolutely nothing could exist, that's kind of just like a hubris in terms of how you view the world. There's so much we don't understand. So I'm not like in that camp, but I've never myself experienced anything, although I don't even think I would put myself in a situation to experience something scary.
Yeah.
So,
Fair enough.
yeah.
In the house that we ultimately did buy in Milwaukee, my mom is convinced there was a friendly ghost. She was okay with it. It was in the laundry room, and I was always afraid to go in that room. Like, I thought it was weird too. It did have a weird vibe, but she was like, no, it's a friendly ghost. He flickers the lights sometimes, but he's chill. So it doesn't have to be scary.
That's so funny. Yeah. It's interesting how like these things gain life, right? Like they're often based on something real that happened and then often like a misunderstanding or like a misinterpretation and then it gets a life of its own. I'm thinking there was this okay, so I came across this story when I was doing my research on New Orleans that I didn't have time to share earlier, but it's just kind of fun because it has to do with vampires and I'm very into
Ooh.
vampires.
You are?
Yeah. Not like Twilight vampires, but like I'm into like, it's called What We Do in the Shadows.
Okay, I don't know that one.
Oh my God. Think The Office, that type of documentary comedic filmmaking plus vampires. So it's like this coven of vampires who have like a film crew following them around. They're like day-to-day lives.
That's
It's hilarious. You should watch it. So I'm into that. And I'll tell the story really quickly. Okay, so this is the story of Ursuline's Convent in New Orleans. Basically, at the time, all these French white men had colonized Louisiana and they needed to find wives. So the nuns at the convent offered to help find brides for these men. And that meant, of course, finding them in France and shipping over some nice white Catholic girls. So these women were put on a boat from France, and the French government gave them each one box to bring their things in. Of course, it just happened to be a box that was long and narrow and shaped like the size of a body. They did not send the ship with enough food, particularly not enough fresh fruits and vegetables. So all of the girls got scurvy. And then when they landed and they were deboarding the ship, they tried to do it at night because they didn't want their future husbands to see them in this like unhealthy, emaciated state. But somebody saw them, of course, and it was just this image of all these like pale girls coughing up blood and carrying these coffin-shaped boxes. And so it spread that vampires have been brought in by the nuns.
Honestly, I would have the same conclusion.
Yeah.
Honestly, like I don't blame the villagers for this one. Like that's yeah.
So then an angry mob tried to burn down the convent. I guess these nuns were pretty persuasive because they managed to get themselves out of that situation. But then the windows of this top floor where the girls were kept have supposedly been nailed shut ever since.
Oh my God.
Mm-hmm.
Whoa, that's freaky. Wow, I can't believe I was defending the villagers like 2 seconds ago. Then when you were like, and then they burnt them down. I was like, oh, fuck, never mind. Like, screw the villagers.
The nuns prevented them from being burnt down. Yeah. But yeah, it's hard to imagine those girls met a happy end after being accused of being a vampire. And also fucking getting scurvy. Like, come on, French government. Why couldn't you just send them with some oranges?
Why was my first thought like, I wonder if people on the carnivore diet have scurvy?
Honestly, a good thought. Good thought.
Why was everyone getting scurvy being on a boat? Like, I go 3 weeks sometimes without eating a piece of fruit, and I'm fine. Like,
are you fine? Are you? Discussion for another time. We'll question Jennifer's diet.
Oh my goodness. Well, this is great. Fun.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
If you enjoy the pod, we would love for you to give us a follow and rate us on Apple Podcasts, which helps us get the word out and reach new listeners. Our sources are available on Patreon, where if you choose to become a patron, you'll also get access to bonus content, our monthly book club, and our eternal gratitude.
If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a topic for a future episode, email us at everythingiknowabouttpod@gmail.com or DM us across all socials at EikaPod, that's EIKA pod. Thanks for listening and see you next week.